I actually have, I don't know if you can see it, but I've actually got a hole in the floor.
Don't you try to knock it with 57 rockets are falling through the holes in the bottom of my pocket. So when it comes to factors, my clothes are just untied. That is never factored in what would make a typical day. Typical day.
So I've been inside cleaning up the inside floor, and it's not too bad. I've actually cleaned it several times before and painted it and everything, but this time I'm going to put some black sealant to tidy it all up. And I've just noticed down here, these are the plugs, rubber bungs, but here I actually have, I don't know if you can see it, but I've actually got a hole in the floor here and there. And this is because this is the jack point underneath. It's being continually pushed up and down and up and down, up and down until it's cracked. The jack point's actually there.
Here are the tools I use for the floor. So I've got my angle grinder with a stripping disc, also a cutting wheel. There's also a grinding wheel I used as well. And then a chisel, a drill with a spot weld drill, my adapter so I could use my row lock discs, some panel beating hammers, some snips, my drill adapter that's a nibbler on one side and a saw on the other, hacksaw. I've got another video on that. If you go and check out that, you'll see that cool tool. And some markers, spanners, and a splitting knife, which was really useful, seam splitting knife. And the obligatory vacuum cleaner. I used a stripping disc to reveal where the spot welds were, and then I center punched each one and then used a spot weld removing drill. There's a couple of points where I went through the floor, so I have to fix that later, but you can see the rust underneath the floor here. Pretty bad. So here's the floor with the cross member out before grinding back. Up close, lots of pitting, quite bad. Nothing on the arch, so it just shows you where the water tends to sit. And so this is the new floor pan, which I laid down, and I've then had to mark where the actual starter is, because at the moment he has the starter on the floor. So I marked around there, cut it out with a metal nibbler, and then they're actually magnets, really strong magnets holding the piece in place. And about the magnets, an unusual thing that happened while I was welding this in is that I had cut the floor pan out and laid it up, and it was pretty good, ready to weld. And I started putting my tack welds in, and when I got to one spot on that actual tunnel there, it just would not weld. It would splatter and carry on and really out of control. So I left that section and just went around and welded up the whole rest of the panel. And then later I thought I'll tackle that again, and tried it again. Again, it was just arcing and going completely crazy. I just couldn't get anything to stick to that section of the panel. And it was only about the size of, 20-cent piece. So I thought maybe it was because there was some old some kind of contamination on the panel. So I cleaned it all back and sanded it again. It was absolutely shiny metal, and it still wouldn't weld. So I thought I'd research that later. I went and moved on. I started grinding some of the old welds off, and all of the dust started to form into a circle around that problem area. And then I realized suddenly that it was the shape of the magnet. And what had actually happened was the magnet had fallen behind the panel in the various, pulling the panel in and out and that sort of thing. One of the magnets was behind the panel, and it was just causing such a crazy magnetic field in that spot where I just could not get it to weld. So there you go. Magnetic fields and welding don't mix. Which makes sense because it's an electrical arc that's occurring. So of course it's going to be affected by a magnetic field, but it wasn't until the small metal filings started to form a round shape that I realized the magnet was there. When I took that away, beautiful welds, that was probably the easiest spot to weld then because it was the cleanest. So it just proves the old saying again that it's not rocket science, it's brain surgery. So then marked around it. And on the edges too, I had to reveal the spot welds and then drill those through. And here is the Flaw coming out. And you can see gaping hole, but you can see how bad the Flaw pan is here, and underneath really thin, and pinholes all the way through it. Those tabs are where the fuel lines run underneath. So I'm going to create new ones to put onto the new floor panel, and I'll just put some rubber over them and some heat shrink to protect the cables and brake line and fuel line. That's a jacking point, which I'm not going to bother about because that was used when the car was built and not a good idea to jack from that position anymore anyway. So there's the old flat floor panel. And a gaping hole. And the next job was to tediously grind and use a pair of pliers and a seam splitting knife to cut away that old dead layer of panel. So it's going to overlap at the front, but I'm going to do a butt weld, a butt seam around so that I get a nice clean floor panel with where no water can sit between the two layers. If I did a joggled weld joint, then I risk the problem of water getting in between the two joins and starting all over again. So I thought I'd butt weld it and get it as neat as I could, and then I can seal the whole thing top and bottom. So on this floor panel, on the new floor panel, I've made a couple of tabs here, which I just cut from some 0.8mm mild steel and sprayed them with some weld-through primer and welded them into the same positions as they were on the previous panel. So I used the previous panel as a bit of a jig to work out where to put them. And that's where the fuel line and the brake lines and the starter cables will run as well. I laid it in there again just to make sure that it was going to fit. It was going to be okay. And then I used my little spacing clamps and tried to make sure that I call them the water channels, because that's really what they are on a mini floor. The channels, which are actually supposed to be stiffening bends in the metal, make sure that they align. And I used some bit of a hammer and dolly to get them so that they met up. And then also my magnets were very useful as well. And then with some basic welds around just to hold it in place, and heaps more welding later to join up all the dots. And this is the other side of the floor. And what I did on both panels is that I sprayed the panel with some rust converter, because there was tiny little pits of rust. Even though I cleaned it up with a wire brush and everything, there was still some, so I sprayed it with some rust converter. So that's what that black is on the toe board there. And my panel is going to sit on top of that and then be spot welded to it. Actually, MIG welded, plug welded. So what I also did was I got some marine adhesive sealant and ran that all along that lip so that there was no bare metal exposed at all. And then put my panel on top of it, and then put the bolt through that goes into the there's like a member that comes from the front section, and I bolted it together and squeezed it down so I got some squeeze out, so the actual marine adhesive squeezed out through the holes, and clamped it down so it's a watertight seal and no bare metal. And then what I did was I just used the drill later to re-drilled the holes slightly just so it scraped away some of that adhesive and gave me access to the bare metal. And then I sprayed some weld through primer on that and then went along and tack welded it in place. And that worked really well, although I had to be really careful of fire because the adhesive was very flammable and kept on igniting. So I had a wet rag, kept on dampening it down. And here are the two panels in place. And one of the problems I had was the spot weld holes from the spot weld drill. So my solution for that, because they're too big to really, I couldn't get a copper in there behind there to actually fill it in. So I just took another piece of spare metal that I had that was the right thickness and used my spot weld drill to drill out some circles to be able to put them in place and weld them in. And then once I ground them back and put a bit of primer on them, they were pretty good. Not perfect, but remember it's underneath the seat rail, so you're not going to see it anyway. It's just to stop water from getting in, to seal it up, hopefully stop the rust. So this is the cross member that I basically underneath stripped off all of the old paint, which was rusty, so basically just all the surface rust. Then sprayed the whole thing with some rust converter as well, which gave me a nice clean black painted surface. And then epoxy seal that, and then a final coat of deadener sealer as well, just to make sure that no water gets in. So here's my floor now with the complete welds all the way along, and then also a coat of super etch epoxy primer, which is great stuff, dries really fast, and the local metal store sells it. It's great. It's only about $10 a can, which is really good here because you can pay 25 Australian dollars for a can of epoxy etch primer. So this stuff's great. Sprayed it all on, did about 3 or 4 coats, and then I'll leave it a few days, clean it all off again, and do another couple of final coats on it. So here it is. You can see where the floor panel is, but it's pretty good. Once my cross member is in there, it should be a pretty nice repair. So also I rubbed this whole thing down with grease and wax remover just to clean it all up, and got all the wax, all the rust off. And then there was some tiny little pits of rust as well, which I couldn't get off. So I just sprayed the whole thing with rust converter to give me a nice clean base coat. And then wiped it all down again with grease remover to make sure it's super clean, and gave it some coats of epoxy. The next thing I did here was mark out the floor where I was going to put the seam sealer, and then painted the seam sealer on, also around, all the way around the weld, as you can see in the foot weld, to make sure it's properly sealed. I also did this from the underside as well. Not so much fun lying on the floor of the garage. And then here is, you can see where it's dried. It's really good. It gives like a strong, thick plastic sort of coating to protect the seam. So that's going to be covered by the cross member, which the seat bracket's attached to. The next thing I did was lay down the cross member, mark out where the holes were going to go, where the welds were going to go, and then used my finger sander to grind back those sections back to fresh steel so the weld would work better. It seems counterintuitive, but that's what I did. And then I sprayed it with some weld through primer to protect it and to help seal it, because I couldn't weld through the epoxy primer. It's just not great for welding through. So here you'll see trying to get the cross member lined up with the floor, and what I did was actually used a jack underneath the floor with a plank of wood and just screwed it up, wound it, and watched it until it came up to floor level. So here's the jack underneath with a piece of wood, and here you'll see as I wind the jack, it pushes the floor up into place. So I basically clamped the ends of the cross member in place first to make it strong, tack welded that, and then brought the floor up to meet the cross member, and then welded them in place from there. Now that I've got it fitting well, and I use the wooden end of a hammer so I wouldn't damage the paint. I used that down there and tapped the top of it until I got it to sit flat on the floor. Now I'm going to pull it out and I'm going to put a bead of this polyurethane sealer, which is a universal adhesive sealant, and it's a marine sealant, so it should be a good thing to do. And what I'm going to do, instead of putting it on the floor, which would then I would have to mark out where my spot welds, where my MIG welds are going to go, I'm actually just going to run it on the underside of this and smear it over the actual rail on the underside, so that I only get it on the parts in between the welds, if you know what I mean. And then I'm going to clamp it down to the floor and tack it in place, and we'll see how it looks after that. It should give me a really good seal. Now, I'm actually dreaming about rust these days, so to stop it from happening, when I was pulling the channel in and out, I scraped it again and had some bare metal, so I've just sprayed on some weld through primer so I don't dream about that. Here's an area that's always been a problem, is this handbrake lever is broken off several times, so I've created a little bracket that I had lying around, and I'm going to weld that into place there, and that should help it be a bit more solid. Here we are inside now with the center strengthener in place, and I basically put it right back in exactly the same spot where it was before, and I've done some plug welds across there. Not beautiful, but it will do the job. I'm going to run some seam sealer over that as well, and of course it's all sealed underneath that as well on the floor, and I think it's looking pretty good. So there it is. I'm just so glad I didn't go down the route of making a template and trying to replace the rusty sections of floor instead of doing the whole thing, because that would have been a complete waste of time. Hang on a sec, I did.